Christmas time is obviously great for a lot of reasons. But one thing that probably isn't thought about a lot is Christmas street photography. This is a great time to go out and do street photography because there's a lot going on out on the streets. There's loads of people out and about shopping and doing things and meeting up and going for coffee or hot chocolates or whatever it might be. There's a lot of activity to photograph. There's a lot of interesting candid moments, loads of stuff going on. And of course, those beautiful Christmas lights as well, which can make for a beautiful photograph. But we're gonna go through a few tips to make sure you get the best out of trying to capture those Christmas street scenes. First up, let's talk about lighting. Now, there's two kinds of times a day to go out and shoot your Christmas street photography. One is in the daytime when you've got lots of light. Now, in that sort of time, I tend to set my camera as kind of settings and then forget about it, just focus on looking for the nice candid moments. I'll usually go for something like f4 and then a reasonable shutter speed like 1/400th of a second. That way I know I'm not going to get blur from the shutter speed or kind of handshake or movement or anything like that, and I've got enough depth of field to kind of play around with. I'll set my autofocus to usually face detect or something like that because I'm going to be photographing people, and I'll set my ISO to auto. That way the camera's doing all of the work, I just have to look for the moments to photograph, and it frees me up. I don't have to think about exposure, I don't have to think about autofocus and all that kind of stuff and a focus point. I'm just scanning around, and that way when I see something happen, I can immediately bring my camera up, snap, done. Now when it gets a little bit later on in the day and the sun sets and it's only 4 o'clock or something like that, that's a great time to switch up a little bit. Now you've got loads of beautiful Christmas lights to think about, but exposure is probably a little bit trickier. This one you probably want to use as fast an aperture as you possibly can, so I'll often go for f2.8, unless I'm using a prime lens, in which case I might go for f1.8 or something like that, and I might drop my shutter speed a little bit. Something like 1/250th of a second or even 1/200th of a second is probably fine, and leaving that ISO on auto means I'm going to probably get away with almost all of it exposure-wise. In terms of the lenses that I'll use, I like to use a zoom lens because it allows me to compose very fast. That way, again, I can just be looking for moments and I can try and frame myself up so that I am standing the opposite side from a bunch of lights or a Christmas tree or something like that, so that if I'm facing that way and the lights are that way, whatever I'm shooting, whoever's there, they're going to be around about some lights. I can have some nice lights in the background. I might even deliberately position myself in a spot to try and wait for someone to walk past the perfect framing or something like that. So a bit of patience there as well. Now that's lighting, but let's talk about lens choice as well, because this is an interesting one. For me personally, I like to use a longer lens. I like to use a zoom lens. A 70-200 is probably my ideal setup for this kind of thing. I prefer to be further away. I just feel like it allows me to get candid moments. I'm not kind of interrupting, I'm not up in people's faces, and I just personally prefer it that way. I just like being a little bit further away and taking a photo like that. It means I can get some nice lens compression. It means I can control my background with the zoom. There's a lot of advantages there for me. A 70-200 is fantastic for that, but a 24-70 is also really good. I like that. f2.8 versions allow me some great flexibility when it does get a little bit darker. Now that's not to say there's not a place for prime lenses. 50mm, 85mm, and I personally love a 135mm for this kind of thing. I just feel like it allows me a lot of options and usually a faster aperture. So specifically for this time of year, it's fantastic when it gets a little bit darker. Since it is Christmas time, a big part of what you might be photographing probably incorporates a little bit of storytelling. So that doesn't mean that you have to capture some grand narrative in your photo. And I often think when people talk about storytelling in photos, it often feels a bit like that, like you're trying to force something into the photo that isn't there. But storytelling can be really small. It can just be a very small moment between two people. And especially around Christmas with the lights and the trees, it can be really heartwarming, and it can really mean quite a lot. And you can really get a lot out of a photo by not only the atmosphere, the feeling around it, and you can achieve that with things like Christmas trees and lights. But also, like I say, that interaction between two people can be a really big part of it. We recently did a video about foreground elements, and that actually comes into it here as well. I like to use either shooting through a crowd or shooting past lights or something like that to try and help to tell a story with street photography. So for example, this man dancing in the street was really cool. It was a really interesting moment. He was dancing, there were some people playing trumpets. It was just a nice time and people were kind of cheering him on and it's all a good time, but just the shot of him, fine. But I waited until people were crossing the paths so I could shoot through the people to get a shot of him. So now you've got the story of not only him dancing, but he's dancing in a crowded kind of shopping area. And it's just a better story. It's just a more interesting end result. And the visual element of having that foreground frames him up quite nicely as well. One final tip for capturing as much of this as you possibly can. You might want to shoot a little bit wider than you otherwise intend, because you can crop it a little bit later. And sometimes I will do that deliberately. If a lot of things are happening very fast, I'll go to take the photo just a little bit wider with the intention of reframing it and cropping it a little bit later. There's nothing worse than getting back to edit your photos and finding that you're just a little bit too tight, or you need to rotate it, let's say, but you don't have enough image to do it. And now you need to go to Photoshop and fiddle around and try and make it work, but it doesn't really work. And that's not ideal. So I sometimes shoot just a little bit wider with the intention then of later cropping it as well. Those are just some tips about how I like to go and capture Christmas street photography. I just think this is a wonderful time of year to go and shoot that kind of stuff. But I'd love to hear if you have any tips as well. Pop them down in the comments. We'll get a little conversation going, because you guys have got some great ideas. And I love reading through your comments, whether it's in the day or whether it's in the evening or whatever it might be. They'll pop up on my phone. I love seeing that stuff. And you guys have got some really, really good insight as well. So I'd love to see any ideas or tips or anything like that you have, so we can all get out and take those beautiful Christmas street photos. Of course, there's links in the description for all the different kit I use for this video and all the photos down in the description, including that beautiful Canon RF 135mm. Ho ho! What a lens, and the R6 II as well. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the videos, new videos all the time. I'll see you in the next video. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.